Canada's political culture during the 19th and first half of the 20th century was one centered around fear of Indigenous natives and other groups that were deemed inferior in society. Similarly, problems between the Jewish and Muslim people have long plagued Israel. However, within Canada, tensions between Canadians and the Indigenous people have diffused and are almost non-existent since the 20th century, whereas Israel continues to be in a constant state of war. The 1970s marked a dramatic shift in cultural attitudes towards guns as homicide rates by firearms were at an all-time high. As you can see from this graph from Canada Statistics, the rate was 1.26 per 100,000. In 1977, Bill C-51 was passed and marked the most pivotal clampdown on gun laws. Leaners and Lester's study observed homicide rates 7 years before and after the bill. They found that homicide rates by guns significantly declined. It wasn't until 1989 when the horrific Montreal Massacre occurred at the College of École Polytechnique. This violent act was the impetus that fueled women's coalitions to band together and push for even further legislation by influencing the Liberal Party. The second important piece of legislation that passed was Bill C-17. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police website notes how this bill increased restrictions to get a firearms acquisition certificate. This is similar to Israel, as they reacted to terror attacks by restricting the issuance of firearms licenses as well. Israel's legislative changes were shown to be relatively ineffective at decreasing homicide rates. However, Canada's legislative initiatives were shown to significantly decrease homicide rates by firearm. GunPolicy.org's most recent survey reports the rate at 0.45, where Israel's homicide rate by firearm is at 0.81.
Though the UK is now known for having some of the strictest gun regulations in the world, prior to World War I there was very little regulation at all. Following the war, British leaders feared that the uprisings in Russia would influence their working-class citizens. There was also concern over the increase of armed and trained individuals in the population, with soldiers coming home from the war. The Hungerford Massacre of 1987 was the UK's first major mass shooting which resulted in legislation and remains one of its deadliest to this day. Michael Ryan, who carried out the attack, killed 16 people before taking his own life. He injured 15 more. He legally owned the guns used to carry out the massacre, as well as several others, including 2 shotguns, 3 semi-automatic rifles, and 3 pistols. The Dunblane school shooting is also one of the UK's deadliest mass shootings and resulted in the death of 15 schoolchildren, a teacher, and the assailant, Thomas Hamilton. Hamilton legally owned the guns he used as well. This massacre resulted in the prohibition of private gun ownership in 1997. The first firearms-related legislation in 1870 and 1903 did not aim to prevent gun deaths, but to generate revenue. It was in the post-World War I era that the United Kingdom began to regulate firearms. There have been several amendments made to the Firearms Act, the first of which occurred in 1937. In 1968, all existing firearms legislation was consolidated. In 1988 and 1999, amendments were made to the Firearms Act as a result from the Hungerford Massacre and Dunblane school shooting respectively. The next piece of legislation, aimed at reducing violent crimes, came in 2006. Here we have gun deaths per 100,000 in key years prior to a major event, the year of that major event, and the year following. As you can see, gun deaths dropped in the years following legislation changes.
The United States is unique when it comes to the issue of guns and gun violence. It has, since its inception, had very loose gun laws. It wasn't until the 1930s that the U.S. began to implement gun restrictions. However, many of these laws rarely affected gun ownership, but they affected the sale and commerce of these guns. Most of the gun control laws were reactions to successful or attempted assassination attempts of presidents in the 20th century. The National Firearms Act of 1934 was the first piece of legislation passed in the United States. It was a response to the Valentine's Day Massacre of 1929, as well as the attempted assassination attempt of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1933. The law, which imposed a tax on the manufacturing, selling, and transporting of firearms, as well as listed in the law among them short-barrel shotguns, rifles, machine guns, firearm mufflers, and silencers. The tax which was imposed on these guns was $200, which was fairly high for the time, but was put in place to suppress the transfer of weapons. The next act was the Gun Control Act of 1968. This act was in response to a turbulent decade that shook the nation. Among those assassinated in the 60s were President John F. Kennedy, his brother, the Attorney General Robert Kennedy, Malcolm X, and Dr. Martin Luther King. President Lyndon B. Johnson pushed for this legislation to pass, and it did in 1968. The act banned imports on guns with no sporting purpose, but put age restrictions on the purchase of handguns, and prohibited the mentally ill or felons from buying guns. The next two acts were the Brady Handgun Violence Act, which was passed in 1993, which for the first time required background checks to buy a gun from a licensed dealer, manufacturer, or importer. It also created the National Instant Criminal Background Check System. Next was the Assault Weapons Ban, which was slipped into a larger act known as the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act. This law put in place a temporary ban on assault weapons from 1994 to 2004. For each of the statistics we looked over of gun deaths and gun homicides, the United States rose every single year in comparison to Israel, which usually stayed the same.
Since its independence, Israel has been in a near constant state of war with the surrounding Arab population over the rightful ownership of the holy city of Jerusalem. In Israel, it requires mandatory service in their military for its citizens, 3 years for men and 2 years for women. Israel only has 3 officially recognized wars. Most of the gun violence comes from terror attacks, with a few being from Israeli private citizens. Under the Israeli firearms law, there is no clear right to own a gun in Israel. Since 1992, permits and licensing to obtain firearms has gradually been more restrictive, including issuing firearms to those working in dangerous environments, and they have to submit health documents and weapon proficiency. In Israeli law, self-defense is not always guaranteeing you getting a license to receive a firearm. Since 1993, the average gun deaths are about 0.84 per 100,000 people in Israel, and that goes as low as 0.1 per 100,000 and as high as 1.6. Interestingly enough, even though the gun laws have been more restrictive, as of 2013, the deaths were 0.81 per 100,000. So the gun laws getting more restrictive has not had much change on the average deaths over the last 20 years.